The moment Xavier Kincaid spotted the woman sprawled on the desert floor beside her lame horse, needle and thread in hand stitching tiny constellations onto a piece of rawhide stretched across her lap. He thought the Arizona sun had finally cooked his brain. No sensible person sat out in the open desert at high noon in August 1883, let alone someone who looked like they had been riding hard for days. Her chestnut mare stood three-legged nearby, favoring her left foreleg something terrible, and the woman herself looked half dead from exhaustion and thirst. But there she was, bent over her work with the focused intensity of someone who had nothing left in the world except the task before her, her fingers moving with practiced precision, despite the tremor of dehydration. Xavier urged his buckskin gelding forward, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle on his saddle before he caught himself. The woman did not look dangerous, just desperate, and there was a difference he had learned to recognize during his years running cattle between Gila Bend and Tucson. He was 26 years old and had seen enough of Arizona territory to know when someone was running from something versus running toward something. This woman looked like she was doing both. "Madam," he called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting, "you need help." She looked up sharply, and Xavier felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her face. Dirt-streaked and sunburned as she was, Grace Zimmerman was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness, and everything to do with the fierce intelligence burning in her hazel eyes. She was young, probably no more than 23 or 24, with dark blonde hair coming loose from a practical braid, and the kind of determined set to her jaw that suggested she would bite before she would beg. "My horse threw a shoe and came up lame," she said, her voice hoarse from lack of water. "I am resting her before I continue on foot." "On foot where?" Xavier swung down from his saddle, moving slowly so as not to spook her. "There is nothing but desert between here and Gila Bend, and that is still 15 miles southwest. Then I walk 15 miles. She turned her attention back to her rawhide, her needle moving through the leather to create another star in what Xavier could now see was an elaborate map of the night sky. "I have walked farther." Xavier crouched down a respectful distance away, studying the piece she was working on. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. She had somehow managed to mark out entire constellations with tiny knots and stitches, creating a three-dimensional representation of the heavens that must have taken weeks to complete. But more than that, she had added notation marks that looked like mathematical calculations, as if she was using the stars themselves to chart a course. "You are navigating by the stars," he said slowly, understanding dawning. "You are stitching yourself a map." "I am making sure I never forget the way." Grace's hands stilled for a moment, and Xavier saw them shake. "I need to remember how to get somewhere safe, and I cannot write it down where anyone might find it. But this, people see needlework and think it is just decoration. They do not look close enough to see that it is so much more." Xavier pulled his canteen from his belt and held it out to her. "Drink first, then you can tell me where safe is, and I will help you get there." She looked at him with such naked suspicion that Xavier felt it like a physical blow. "Why would you help me? You do not know me." "Because you are sitting in the desert dying of thirst while mapping stars, and that tells me whatever you are running from is bad enough that you would rather die free than live caught." Xavier kept his hand extended, the canteen hanging between them like an offering. "And because my mama raised me to help people who need it, especially women traveling alone through country that eats people alive." Grace's throat worked as she swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the water. Finally, she reached out and took the canteen, and Xavier saw how badly her hands shook as she unscrewed the cap. She drank deeply, and he had to force himself not to tell her to slow down. When she finally lowered the canteen, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and met his gaze directly. "My husband died 3 months ago in Prescott," she said flatly. "I thought I would be free then, but his brother claimed me along with the rest of the estate. Said the law entitled him to everything his brother owned, and that included me. I ran 4 weeks ago, and I have been riding south ever since. I need to get to Mexico, where American law cannot touch me." Xavier felt fury rise hot in his throat. He knew the law she was talking about, had seen it twisted and abused more times than he cared to count. A woman with no male relatives to claim her could be treated as property, passed from one man to another like livestock or furniture. It was legal robbery dressed up in respectability, and it made him sick. "Mexico is still 3 weeks hard riding from here, longer on foot," he said carefully. "Your brother-in-law, he is looking for you. He hired men to look for me." Grace screwed the cap back on the canteen and handed it back to him. "I have been keeping off the main roads, sleeping rough, trading my wedding ring for that horse in Wickenburg. I thought I could make it to Gila Bend before she went lame, but I was wrong. So now I walk, and I use the stars to make sure I am still heading toward the border." Xavier looked at her mare, then back at Grace. "That horse is not walking anywhere for at least a week, maybe longer. And you are not walking 15 miles through this heat without water. I have a small spread about 8 miles east of here, up in the hills where there is a spring and some shade. You come back with me, rest up for a few days, and then I will take you south myself. I know trails that avoid all the main roads, places where no hired gun is going to think to look." "Why would you do that?" Grace's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You could turn me over to my brother-in-law yourself, probably collect a reward." "I do not want his money, and I do not return women to men who treat them like property." Xavier stood up and offered her his hand. "My name is Xavier Kincaid. I run cattle on a patch of land my father left me, and I give you my word that no harm will come to you under my roof. You can trust me or not, but if you stay out here, you are going to die. And if your brother-in-law's men find your body, they are going to find that star map too, and they will know exactly which direction you were headed." Grace stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, her hazel eyes searching his face for any hint of deception. Xavier held still, letting her look her fill. He knew what she would see. A tall, lean cowboy with sun-weathered skin, dark brown hair that needed cutting, and blue eyes that his mother always said were too honest for his own good. He wore practical work clothes, had 3 days of stubble on his jaw, and probably smelled like horse and sweat. But he kept his gaze steady and open, and he hoped that was enough. Finally, Grace reached up and took his hand. Her fingers were slender and calloused from needlework, and they gripped his with surprising strength as he pulled her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and Xavier steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "If you try anything," she said quietly, "I have a knife and I will use it, fair enough." Xavier guided her toward his horse, then paused. "What about your mare? I will have to leave her. She cannot walk." Xavier looked at the horse, saw the exhaustion and pain in her eyes, and made a decision. "I will come back for her tonight with a wagon. If she is still here and still alive, I will bring her back to my place to heal. But right now, I need to get you out of this sun." He helped Grace mount his buckskin, then swung up behind her. She stiffened at the proximity, but she did not protest when he reached around her to take the reins. Xavier kept one arm loosely around her waist to keep her steady and urged his horse into an easy walk heading northeast toward the hills. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Xavier could feel how tense Grace was, every muscle in her body held tight with readiness to fight or flee. He kept his touch impersonal, and his attention on the trail, giving her space to adjust to the situation. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he was grateful when they finally reached the foothills, where scraggly juniper trees offered occasional patches of shade. "Tell me about your ranch," Grace said suddenly, her voice still hoarse despite the water she had drunk. "If I am going there, I should know what to expect." "It is not much of a ranch," Xavier admitted. "My father homesteaded the land 20 years ago, before he died in a riding accident when I was 16. I have about 200 acres in the hills, most of it too rocky for anything but cattle and stubborn men. I run about 50 head, sell them in Tucson twice a year. There is a 3-room cabin, a barn, and a spring that never runs dry even in the worst droughts. It is isolated enough that I go weeks without seeing another soul, which suits me fine most of the time." "You live alone?" "Just me and the cattle and a dog that is more coyote than anything civilized." Xavier felt Grace relax slightly against him, her spine not quite so rigid. "I had a hired hand for a while, but he got married last year and moved to Phoenix. I've been meaning to find another one, but I keep not getting around to it. Sounds lonely." "Lonely is different than alone," Xavier said. "I got burned bad by a woman in Tucson 3 years back, thought we were going to marry until I found out she was already promised to a banker's son. After that, I decided the company of cattle was less complicated. They do not lie to you about who they are." Grace made a soft sound that might have been agreement or amusement. "I married my husband when I was 18 because my father said it was a good match. Robert Zimmerman was 15 years older than me, respectable, established. What my father did not know was that Robert had gambling debts he could not pay and a taste for whiskey that made him mean. He wanted my dowry more than he wanted a wife." Xavier felt his jaw clench. "Did he hurt you?" "With his fists when he was drunk, with his words when he was sober. But he also traveled for business, sometimes for weeks at a time, and those were the good days. I taught myself needlework during those times, learned to make maps and charts because I liked understanding how to navigate from one place to another. I never thought I would actually need the skill to escape. When he died, how did it happen?" Grace was quiet for so long that Xavier thought she would not answer. Then she said, very softly, "He got thrown by his horse during a drunken midnight ride. Broke his neck when he hit the ground. They found him at dawn, already cold. I cried at the funeral because everyone expected it, but inside I felt nothing except relief. Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Xavier said firmly. "That makes you human. You do not owe tears to a man who spent 5 years hurting you." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, less wary and more companionable. When Xavier's cabin finally came into view, tucked against a hillside with the barn and corrals spread out below it, he felt Grace take in a sharp breath. "It is beautiful," she said, and Xavier heard genuine surprise in her voice. He tried to see it through her eyes. The way the late afternoon sun turned the rocky hills amber and gold, the dark green of the juniper and oak trees clustered around the spring, the neat lines of his fences and the sturdy construction of the buildings his father had built to last. It was not fancy, but it was well maintained and peaceful, and there was something honest about it that appealed to Xavier's practical nature. "It is home," he said simply, guiding his horse down toward the cabin. A rangy yellow dog came bounding out to meet them, barking enthusiastically until Xavier called out, "Enough, Dusty. We have a guest." The dog immediately quieted and fell into step beside the horse, his tail wagging as he sniffed curiously at Grace's boot. Xavier dismounted first, then helped Grace down, steadying her when her legs nearly buckled from exhaustion and hours in the saddle. "You need food, water, and rest," he said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact. "I will get you settled in the cabin, then I need to go back for your mare before dark." "You do not have to do that," Grace protested. "She is just a horse. She is your horse, and she carried you as far as she could before she gave out. That deserves some loyalty." Xavier led Grace toward the cabin, Dusty trotting ahead to hold the door open in his peculiar way of nosing it ajar. Besides, a good horse is worth saving, and she looked good under all that exhaustion. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. The main room served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall and a sturdy table with 2 chairs in the center. Through one doorway, Xavier could see his bedroom, and through another, the small room he used for storage and the occasional guest who never seemed to materialize. "You take my room," Xavier said, nodding toward the bedroom. "I will sleep in the spare room while you are here." "I cannot take your bed." Grace looked around the cabin, her eyes lingering on details. The books stacked on a shelf by the fireplace, the clean dishes drying beside the wash basin, the worn but comfortable-looking furniture. "I can sleep anywhere. I have been sleeping on the ground for weeks." "Which is exactly why you need a real bed now." Xavier moved to the kitchen area and started pulling out supplies. "I will make something to eat while you wash up. There is a basin in the bedroom and clean water in the pitcher. Help yourself to anything you need." Grace hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Xavier heard the sound of water splashing and allowed himself a moment to just stand still and process what he had done. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman being hunted by hired men, and promised to help her escape to Mexico. It was possibly the most reckless thing he had done since he had tried to break that wild Mustang that had left him with 2 cracked ribs, and a healthy respect for creatures that refused to be tamed. But when he thought about Grace sitting in the desert mapping stars with hands that shook from fear and exhaustion, he knew he would make the same choice again. There was something about her that called to something deep in him, a recognition that felt both unfamiliar and absolutely right. He got to work making dinner, keeping it simple. Beans and salt pork, cornbread he had baked that morning, canned tomatoes from the pantry. By the time Grace emerged from the bedroom, looking cleaner but no less exhausted, he had everything laid out on the table. They ate in silence at first, both too hungry for conversation. But as the edge wore off their appetites, Grace looked across the table at him and asked, "What made you come out to that part of the desert today? It is not close to anything." "One of my steers went wandering," Xavier said. "I have been tracking him for 2 days. Never did find the damn fool animal, but I found you instead, so I figure it balanced out. You might feel differently when those hired men show up looking for me. Let them come." Xavier met her gaze steadily. "I have dealt with hired guns before. Most of them are cowards who depend on intimidation more than actual skill. The ones who are not cowards, well, I know how to handle myself in a fight." Grace studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "I do not want anyone dying because of me." "No one is going to die," Xavier promised, even though he could not be sure that was true. "We will keep you hidden, let you rest and recover, then I will take you south through the back trails. By the time anyone thinks to look for you this far from the main roads, you will already be across the border. And you would do all that for a stranger?" Xavier considered the question, turning it over in his mind. "My father used to say that we are defined by what we do when no one is watching and nothing is forcing us to act. Every time we choose kindness over convenience, we become a little more human and a little less animal. You needed help, I could provide it, so I did. It is as simple as that." "Nothing is ever as simple as that," Grace said, but there was something softer in her expression now, a loosening of the perpetual guardedness. but I am grateful anyway. I have been running for so long that I almost forgot what it feels like when someone offers help without expecting something in return. After dinner, Xavier saddled a fresh horse and rode back out to collect Grace's mare, taking a wagon loaded with water and feed. He found the horse where they had left her, lying down but still alive. It took some coaxing and a lot of patience, but he finally got her loaded into the wagon and brought her back to his barn. She had thrown the shoe and cracked her hoof, which explained the severe lameness, but with time and care, she would heal. Xavier got her settled in a stall with food and water, then tended to his own horses before finally heading back to the cabin. Grace had washed the dishes and was sitting by the fire, her rawhide star map spread across her lap. She looked up when he entered, and Xavier saw dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion that went bone deep. "Your mare is in the barn," he reported. "Cracked hoof, but it should heal clean if she stays off it. I will check on her twice a day." "Thank you." Grace's hands moved absently over the rawhide, tracing the patterns of stars. "I was just reviewing my route. If I leave from here, I will need to adjust for the eastern deviation." Xavier moved closer, fascinated despite himself by the intricacy of her work. "How did you learn to do this?" "Trial and error mostly. I had a book about celestial navigation that I bought from a peddler, and I taught myself the mathematics. Then I practiced stitching until I could make the maps durable enough to survive travel." She ran her finger along a particular constellation. "This is Ursa Major. I use it to find true north, then calculate distances based on how far the stars move across the sky during the night. It is not perfectly accurate, but it is close enough to keep me heading in the right direction." "It is remarkable," Xavier said honestly. "I have never seen anything like it." Grace looked up at him, and something passed between them in that moment, a connection that felt like recognition. Then she looked away, folding up her rawhide carefully. "I should sleep," she said. "I am so tired I can barely think straight. Go on then." Xavier stepped back, giving her space. "I will be in the other room if you need anything." Grace stood, then hesitated. "Xavier, I need you to understand something. I cannot afford to trust people. I cannot afford to let my guard down or believe that anywhere is truly safe. But I want you to know that I appreciate what you are doing, even if I cannot fully trust it yet." "I understand," Xavier said gently. "Trust is earned, not given. You take all the time you need." She nodded and disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Xavier banked the fire and made his way to the spare room, which was barely large enough for the narrow cot, and the few boxes of his father's belongings he had never gotten around to sorting through. He lay down fully clothed, his rifle within easy reach, and listened to the night sounds of his land. Wind through the trees, the distant call of a coyote, the soft rustling of his cattle settling for the night. He thought about Grace in his bed, her dark blonde hair spread across his pillow, her hazel eyes closed in sleep. He thought about the life she had lived, 5 years married to a man who hurt her, and the courage it must have taken to run when she finally had the chance. He thought about the star map she had stitched with her own hands, a permanent record of the path to freedom. And he thought about the fact that helping her meant putting himself directly in the path of whoever was hunting her, and he discovered that he did not care. Something about Grace Zimmerman had reached past all his carefully constructed defenses and taken root in his chest, and he suspected that, even if she left tomorrow and he never saw her again, she would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he had 3 weeks to help her reach safety. 3 weeks to earn her trust and maybe understand why fate had put her in his path on that scorching August day. 3 weeks to figure out what it meant that looking at her made him feel like he had been wandering lost and had finally found true north. Xavier closed his eyes and willed himself to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and that he needed to be ready for whatever came next. The days fell into a pattern after that. Xavier rose before dawn to tend the animals and check his fences, while Grace slept late and gradually regained her strength. When he returned to the cabin for breakfast, she would have coffee ready and would sit across from him asking careful questions about the land, the trails south, the best way to avoid being tracked. He answered honestly, spreading out his own rough maps and showing her the routes he knew, the water sources that were reliable, the towns to avoid because they were too friendly with territorial law enforcement. Grace proved herself useful in unexpected ways. She mended his clothes with neat, nearly invisible stitches. She organized his chaotic pantry and taught him how to make biscuits that did not taste like saddle leather. She took over the vegetable garden he had been neglecting and coaxed his struggling plants back to life with patience and attention. And every evening, she worked on her star map by firelight, adding details and notations while Xavier read or worked on his own tasks. They talked more as the days passed, the conversation starting careful and superficial but gradually deepening. Grace told him about her childhood in Missouri, how her mother had died when she was 12, and her father had remarried a woman who had no patience for a daughter who preferred books to needlework. She talked about the moment she realized her husband would never change, when she stopped hoping he might sober up or learn to be gentle. She described the night she ran, how she had packed only what she could carry and slipped away while her brother-in-law was in town, and the constant fear that had dogged her ever since. Xavier told her about his father, a hard man but a fair one, who had taught him to work cattle and respect the land. He talked about his mother, who had died of fever when he was 20, and how the cabin still sometimes smelled like her lavender soap, even though it had been 6 years. He described the woman in Tucson who had broken his heart, and how he had learned that being alone was different from being lonely. He told her about the dreams he had for his ranch, how he wanted to expand his herd and maybe buy the adjoining land, build something that would last. Why cattle? Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. It seems like hard work for uncertain profit. Because cattle are honest, Xavier said. They do not pretend to be something they are not. A cow is a cow and it wants food, water, and to be left alone most of the time. I understand that. I respect it. He paused, then added, and because this land is not good for much else. The soil is too rocky for serious farming and there is not enough water for crops. But cattle can survive here and so can I, and that feels like enough most days. You ever get lonely? Grace's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Living out here by yourself with no one to talk to, Xavier considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted. But I think I was lonelier living in town, surrounded by people who never bothered to know me. At least out here the solitude is honest. It does not pretend to be company when it is not. Grace nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. I felt that way in my marriage. Lonelier with my husband than I ever was by myself. At least when I was alone, I did not have to pretend to be happy. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Xavier found himself acutely aware of Grace beside him, the way the evening breeze lifted strands of her hair, the way she held herself with a kind of quiet strength that he admired more each day. She had been at his ranch for a week now, and already he could not imagine the cabin without her in it. That realization should have scared him. Instead, it felt inevitable, like watching a storm roll in across the desert and knowing there was no point in trying to outrun it. On the 10th day, trouble arrived. Xavier was repairing a section of fence on the northern boundary of his property when he saw 3 riders approaching from the west. He recognized them immediately as hired guns by the way they sat their horses, arrogant and alert in equal measure, hands never far from their weapons. He set down his tools and waited, his own rifle leaning against the fence post within easy reach. The lead rider was a big man with a scarred face and cold eyes. He pulled up about 20 feet away and looked Xavier over with the kind of assessment that came before violence. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Name is Dutch Carver. I am looking for a woman about 24 years old, dark blonde hair, traveling alone, wondering if you might have seen her pass through." Xavier kept his expression neutral. "I see a lot of things out here. Not much of it includes lone women. What is she to you?" "She belongs to my employer," Carver said bluntly. "Ran away from her lawful guardian. He is offering a substantial reward for her safe return." "Lawful guardian," Xavier repeated, letting skepticism color his tone. "That is an interesting way to describe a man who treats a grown woman like property." Carver's eyes narrowed. "So you have seen her?" "I did not say that." Xavier shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that put him closer to his rifle. "I am just observing that your employer's claim sounds more like slavery than guardianship, and slavery has been illegal for nearly 20 years now." "What I am doing is legal," Carver said, his voice hardening. "Woman has no male relatives to claim her, which makes her husband's brother her lawful guardian under territorial law. She runs away, she is stealing herself, which is theft. Now, you going to tell me if you have seen her, or are we going to have a problem?" "I have not seen any woman matching that description," Xavier lied smoothly. "But even if I had, I would not tell you. Any law that treats a woman like property is a law that deserves to be broken." Carver's hand moved toward his gun, and Xavier snatched up his rifle in one fluid motion. The barrel pointed directly at the hired gun's chest. The other 2 riders immediately drew their weapons, creating a tense standoff. "You pull that trigger, my boys will kill you before your body hits the ground," Carver said calmly. "Maybe," Xavier agreed, "but you will still be dead, and I am betting your employer is not paying your boys enough to die over his missing property. So how about we all just lower our weapons and go our separate ways?" For a long moment, no one moved. Then Carver slowly raised his hand away from his gun, and his companions reluctantly holstered their weapons. Xavier kept his rifle trained on Carver but did not fire. "This is not over," Carver said. "I am going to keep looking, and when I find her, I am going to remember that you lied to me. That will go poorly for you." "I will take my chances," Xavier said. "Now get off my land." Carver jerked his horse's head around and rode off, his men following. Xavier watched them go, his heart pounding but his hands steady. When they were finally out of sight, he lowered his rifle and took a deep breath, the adrenaline leaving him slightly shaky. He finished his fence repair quickly and headed back to the cabin, his mind racing. Carver and his men were clearly professional trackers, and they were working a grid pattern. It was only a matter of time before they expanded their search to include isolated ranches like his. Grace could not stay here much longer, not safely. When he reached the cabin, he found Grace in the garden, a basket of tomatoes on her hip. She took one look at his face and went pale. "They came," she said. "It was not a question. 3 men, led by someone named Dutch Carver. I sent them away, but they will be back, and next time they might bring more men." Xavier set his rifle down and moved to help her with the basket. "We need to leave tonight, head south before they can organize a proper search. Your mare is healed enough to travel slow, and I have 2 other horses that can handle the trip." Grace's hands tightened on the basket. "They found me. I was careful, I stayed off the roads, but they still found me." "They have not found you yet," Xavier corrected gently. They are searching a wide area, and they happen to come across my ranch. I convinced them I had not seen you, but I do not know how long that will hold. We have a narrow window to move before they come back. If I leave, they might leave you alone. Grace's voice was shaking now, fear and exhaustion making her words come fast. I should go by myself. I have put you in enough danger already. Xavier set the basket down and took Grace by the shoulders, making her look at him. You are not going anywhere alone. I told you I would help you reach Mexico, and I meant it. We leave together tonight, take the back trails I know, and stay ahead of Carver and his men. We can do this, Grace, but I need you to trust me. I do, Grace whispered, and Xavier saw the truth of it in her eyes. Somewhere over the past 10 days, she had started to trust him, and that realization felt like a gift he did not deserve but would fight to keep. I trust you, Xavier. I am just scared. Being scared is smart, Xavier said. It keeps us careful, but we cannot let it paralyze us. Now come on, we have a lot to do before sunset. They spent the afternoon preparing for the journey. Xavier loaded his pack horses with supplies, food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, extra clothes. He checked and rechecked their weapons, making sure everything was clean and functional. Grace packed her few belongings and worked on waterproofing her star map, coating it with wax to protect it from the elements. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, they were ready. Xavier saddled 3 horses, his buckskin for himself, a steady mare for Grace, and her own partially healed chestnut as a pack animal. Dusty sat by the corral, whining softly, and Xavier knelt down to scratch his ears. You are staying here, boy, he said quietly. Someone has to guard the place while I am gone. I will be back in a month, maybe sooner. You keep the coyotes out of the chickens here. Dusty licked his hand, understanding in his yellow eyes, and Xavier felt a pang of regret. But he could not bring the dog on a journey like this, not when speed and stealth were essential. Dusty would be fine. He had survived on his own before Xavier had found him, and he would survive now. Grace emerged from the cabin, her face set with determination. She wore practical travel clothes and had tied her hair back in a tight braid. Xavier had lent her a hat to keep the sun off, and she wore it tilted low over her eyes. She looked capable and strong, nothing like the half-dead woman he had found in the desert 10 days ago. Ready? He asked. As I will ever be. Grace took the reins of her mare and mounted with practiced ease. Which way are we heading? Southeast first, toward the Gila River. We will follow it east for a few days, then cut south through the mountains. It is rough country, but that works in our favor. Carver and his men will expect you to take the easier route. Xavier swung into his own saddle and checked that the pack horse was secure. We will travel at night when we can, rest during the heat of the day. It will be slower but safer. They rode out as the last light faded from the sky, leaving the cabin and the small ranch behind. Xavier kept them to a steady pace, not too fast but not dawdling either. The night was clear and cool, stars spreading across the sky in brilliant profusion. He glanced at Grace and saw her looking up, her lips moving as she identified constellations and made mental notes of their position. Your star map is remarkable, Xavier said after they had been riding for an hour. But you know you do not need it anymore, right? You have me to navigate now. Grace looked over at him, her expression unreadable in the darkness. I know, but it makes me feel safer, having a backup plan. What if something happens to you? I need to know I can find my way on my own. Nothing is going to happen to me, Xavier said, with more confidence than he felt. But I understand the impulse. After spending so long having to rely only on yourself, it is hard to trust that someone else will be there. It is not just that. Grace was quiet for a moment, then continued. The map represents something for me. It is proof that I can learn, that I can adapt, that I am more than what my father and my husband tried to make me. When I stitch those stars, I am choosing my own path instead of following the one laid out for me. That matters." Xavier thought about that, about the kind of strength it took to stitch your own map when the world kept trying to tell you where to go. "Then you keep stitching," he said. "And when we get you safely to Mexico, you start a new map for whatever comes next." They rode through the night, stopping only to rest the horses and check their bearings. When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Xavier led them to a sheltered canyon with a small spring where they could rest during the day. He set up a basic camp while Grace tended to the horses, and then they ate a cold breakfast and settled in to sleep through the heat. Xavier took first watch, his rifle across his knees and his eyes scanning the canyon entrance for any sign of pursuit. Grace slept fitfully nearby, her hand curled around the knife she kept under her bedroll. Even in sleep, she could not fully relax, and Xavier felt a surge of protective anger at the men who had made her this way. When it was Grace's turn to keep watch, Xavier lay down and tried to sleep, but his mind would not quiet. He kept thinking about Dutch Carver and his men, about how close they had come to finding Grace. He thought about the 3-week journey ahead of them, all the things that could go wrong, all the ways he might fail to keep her safe. And he thought about what would happen when they reached Mexico, when Grace crossed the border and he had to turn back north without her. That thought bothered him more than it should. He had known Grace for less than 2 weeks. He had no claim on her, no right to expect anything from her except maybe her gratitude. But somewhere between finding her mapping stars in the desert and watching her bring his neglected garden back to life, he had started to fall for her. Not the sudden, desperate infatuation he had felt for the woman in Tucson, but something slower and deeper, like water seeping into rock until it became part of the foundation. He wanted to know everything about her, what made her laugh, what she dreamed about, what she would do with her freedom once she finally had it. He wanted to watch her stitch new star maps for places she had never been, to see her face when she tasted her first real safety in years. He wanted to build something with her, a life where she never had to run or hide or fear the men who thought they owned her. But wanting something did not make it possible, and Xavier forced himself to push those thoughts away. His job was to get Grace to Mexico safely. After that, what happened was up to her. They traveled that way for 5 more nights, riding through darkness, resting during the day, always moving southeast toward the border. Xavier led them through country he knew from years of tracking stray cattle and exploring his territory. Hidden valleys where water ran year-round. Narrow passes through mountain ridges that did not appear on any map. Old Indian trails that white settlers had never discovered. It was slow, careful travel, and every morning when they made camp, Xavier climbed to high ground and checked their back trail for signs of pursuit. On the 6th night, he saw it. A distant campfire about 10 miles northwest, exactly where a tracker would be if he was following their trail. Xavier watched for an hour, marking the fire's position and estimating how many men it represented, then made his way back down to camp with a knot of worry in his gut. Grace looked up when he returned, reading his expression immediately. "They are following us, looks like it." One campfire, probably 3 to 5 men based on the size. "They are still a day behind us, but they are moving faster than I expected." Xavier crouched beside her and pulled out his map, studying it by the light of their carefully shielded fire. "We need to change tactics. If we keep going this way, they will eventually catch up. But if we cut west here, we can cross into rougher country where horses move slower. It will add time to our journey, but it might shake them off our trail." Grace traced the route he indicated, her brow furrowed in concentration. That takes us through the Superstition Mountains. Part of them, yes. Xavier met her gaze steadily. I know the stories about that area, about people who go in and do not come out, but most of that is just legend meant to keep treasure hunters away. The real danger is the terrain itself. It is brutal and unforgiving. But I have been through parts of it before, and I know we can make it if we are careful. And if we do not go that way, then we keep heading southeast and hope we can stay ahead of them long enough to reach the border. But Grace, these men are professional trackers. Eventually they will catch up, and when they do, there will be a fight. I am good with a rifle, but I am not good enough to take on 5 men by myself and guarantee we both come out alive. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving absently over the Rawhide map in her lap. Then she said, "We go through the mountains. I did not come this far to get caught because I was too scared to take a risk." Xavier nodded, relief mixing with apprehension. "We leave in 2 hours, as soon as the moon rises high enough to light our way. Get some sleep if you can." Grace lay down, but Xavier could tell she was not sleeping, just resting with her eyes closed and her body tense. He sat watch, thinking through every detail of the route they would take, trying to anticipate problems before they arose. The Superstition Mountains were not quite as deadly as legend suggested, but they were genuinely dangerous. Steep cliffs, unstable rock, hidden canyons that became death traps in the rain. And water was scarce, which meant they would have to ration carefully and know exactly where the few reliable springs were located. But the same features that made the mountains dangerous also made them ideal for losing pursuit. There were 1,000 places to hide, 1,000 trails that went nowhere, 1,000 ways to disappear if you knew what you were doing. And Xavier did know, at least enough to give them a chance. When the moon rose high enough, he woke Grace and they broke camp quickly, leaving no trace of their presence. They rode west for 2 hours, then turned south into the foothills that marked the beginning of the Superstition Range. The terrain immediately became more difficult. Rocky slopes, thick brush, narrow paths that forced them to ride single file. But Xavier navigated by moonlight and memory, leading them deeper into the mountains. By dawn, they were high enough to look back and see their pursuers' campfire far below in the valley. Xavier watched for a few minutes, then smiled grimly. Carver and his men would have to decide whether to follow them into the mountains or continue on the easier southern route and hope to cut them off later. Either way, Xavier had bought them time. They camped that day in a sheltered bowl surrounded by high rock walls, hidden from view in all directions. Grace was exhausted from the hard riding, her face drawn and pale, and Xavier insisted she rest while he tended the horses and kept watch. But when he finally lay down for a few hours of sleep, Grace shook him awake with urgency in her eyes. "Someone is coming," she whispered. "I heard rocks falling on the eastern approach." Xavier was instantly alert, rifle in hand, as he moved to the edge of their camp and listened. Sure enough, he heard the distinctive sound of shod hooves on stone, moving slowly and carefully up the trail they had used. He counted the rhythm. 1 horse, maybe 2. Not Carver's whole group then, but possibly scouts sent ahead. "Stay here and stay hidden," Xavier told Grace. "I am going to see who it is." He moved quickly and quietly through the rocks, using cover to approach the trail without being seen. When he finally got a clear view, he saw 2 riders. A young man barely out of his teens and an older man who looked like he had been punched hard enough to break his nose. Neither of them was Dutch Carver, and they both looked nervous rather than threatening. Xavier stepped out from cover with his rifle raised. "That is far enough. State your business." Both men immediately put their hands up, the younger one looking terrified. The older man said quickly, "We do not want trouble. We are looking for Xavier Kincaid. Dutch Carver hired us to track a woman, but we want out. We heard Kincaid was helping her, and we figured if we could find him, we could warn him that Carver is planning something bad." Xavier kept his rifle steady, his instincts screaming caution. "Why would you warn me? Carver is paying you." "Not enough to justify murder," the older man said bluntly. "Carver just got orders from his employer. Woman is to be brought back dead or alive, and Carver is leaning toward dead because it is easier. He says they will make it look like she died of exposure or accident, collect the reward for finding her body, and no one will ask questions. We did not sign up to kill women, especially not ones who are just trying to escape bad situations." Xavier studied them carefully, looking for signs of deception. But what he saw was genuine discomfort and shame, the expression of men who had made a poor choice and were trying to correct it. "How many men does Carver have left? 3 plus himself." "He sent us ahead to scout, but we have been arguing about this for days. Finally decided we would rather face being broke than face ourselves in the mirror knowing we helped kill an innocent woman." The older man lowered his hands slowly. "I am Sam Godfrey. This is my nephew Daniel. We are trackers, not killers. We made a mistake taking Carver's money and we are trying to fix it." Xavier considered his options, then lowered his rifle slightly. "Where is Carver now?" "Half a day behind us, maybe less. He is moving fast and he has got the scent. He knows you came into the mountains and he is following." Sam Godfrey glanced at his nephew, then back at Xavier. "He is also talking about burning you out if he finds your ranch empty when he circles back. Man is not rational anymore. He is taking this personally." Xavier felt cold fury wash through him at the thought of Carver burning his home, destroying everything his father had built. But he pushed the emotion aside and focused on the immediate problem. "If you truly want to help, you will ride back down and tell Carver you lost the trail. Send him west while we go south. That will buy us enough time to reach the border." "We can do better than that," Daniel spoke up for the first time, his voice shaking but determined. "We can lead him into Dead Man's Canyon. It is a box canyon about 15 miles west of here. If we can get him inside and then trigger a rock slide at the entrance, it will trap him long enough for you to get a week's head start." "That is a dangerous game," Xavier said slowly. "If Carver figures out you are betraying him before you spring the trap, he will kill you both." "We know," Sam said, "but it is the right thing to do, and we should have done the right thing from the start. Sometimes you have got to risk something to make up for your mistakes." Xavier studied them for another long moment, then made a decision based on instinct and desperation. "All right. You lead Carver west, trap him if you can. But if it goes wrong, you run and you do not look back. I do not want your deaths on my conscience." "Fair enough." Sam gathered his reins and turned his horse. "You get that woman to safety, Kincaid. She deserves better than what she has been dealt." "I intend to," Xavier said. He watched them ride back down the trail, then returned to camp where Grace was waiting with wide, frightened eyes. He explained what had happened, and Grace listened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You trust them?" she asked when he finished. "I trust that they do not want to be part of a murder," Xavier said. "Beyond that, I do not know, but they have bought us an opportunity and we need to take it. We rest for 2 more hours, then we ride hard for the southern pass. If Sam and Daniel succeed, we will have a clear shot at the border. If they fail, at least we will have put more distance between us and Carver." They rested, then rode through the remainder of the day and into the night, pushing themselves and the horses harder than was wise, but having no choice. The terrain gradually became less brutal as they descended the southern slopes of the Superstition Range. And by the time the sun rose on their 15th day since leaving Xavier's ranch, They could see flat desert stretching toward the distant border. They stopped to rest the horses and check their supplies, and Xavier calculated that they were now only 4 days from Mexico, maybe less if they maintained their current pace. He allowed himself a small measure of hope that they might actually make it. Grace came to stand beside him, looking out at the desert. "Do you think those men succeeded, Sam and Daniel?" "I do not know," Xavier admitted. "But either way, we keep moving. We cannot risk stopping until we know you are safe." "And then what?" Grace turned to look at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. "When we reach Mexico, what happens then? You turn around and ride back north, and I disappear into a country where I do not speak the language and know no one." Xavier heard the fear in her voice and something else too, something that made his heart beat faster. "You do not have to disappear alone. I could come with you, help you get settled somewhere safe. You would leave your ranch, your home, everything you have built." Grace shook her head. "I cannot ask that of you. You are not asking. I am offering." Xavier turned to face her fully, the words coming faster now as he realized he had been thinking about this for days without admitting it to himself. "Grace, I have been alone on that ranch for years, telling myself I preferred it that way. But the truth is, I was just scared to risk getting hurt again. Then you came along, and suddenly the cabin felt too empty when you were not in it. The work felt pointless if there was no one to share it with. I have been trying to convince myself that I was just helping you because it was the right thing to do, but that is only part of it. The rest is that I am falling for you, and the thought of saying goodbye when we reach that border is tearing me apart." Grace stared at him, her face showing a storm of emotions: shock, hope, fear, longing. "Xavier, you barely know me, and I am a mess. I am running from my past. I have nothing to offer you except trouble and complications." "You are not a mess, you are brave," Xavier said firmly. "You took your life into your own hands when no one else would help you. You learned to navigate by stars so you would never be lost again. You survived 5 years of hell and came out the other side still able to be kind, still able to trust even when it was terrifying. That is not a mess, Grace. That is strength." "I do not feel strong," Grace whispered. "I feel scared all the time. Scared that I will be caught, scared that I will never be safe, scared that I will never be anything more than what my husband and his brother tried to make me." Xavier reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. "Then let me be scared with you. Let me help you find safe, and once we do, let me stay and build something with you. Not because you need me to, but because I want to. Because when I look at you, I see home in a way I never have before." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and one spilled over to track down her dusty cheek. "What if I cannot give you what you want? What if I am too damaged by everything that happened to ever be a good wife?" "I do not want a wife who is perfect," Xavier said. "I want a partner who is real, someone who challenges me and trusts me and builds something with me that is bigger than either of us alone. You are already that person, Grace. You have been since the day I found you mapping stars in the desert." For a long moment, Grace just looked at him, her hands trembling in his. Then she said, very softly, "I am falling for you too. I have been trying not to, trying to keep my distance because I thought it would hurt less when we had to say goodbye. But it has not worked. Every day I spend with you makes me want to stay more, and that terrifies me because I have never had anything good that did not get taken away." "This will not get taken away," Xavier promised, even though he could not be sure. "We will fight for it. We will build it so strong that nothing can knock it down. But first, we get you across that border and make sure you are legally safe. Then we decide together what comes next." Grace pulled one hand free and reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a tenderness that made Xavier's breath catch. "When this is over," she said, "when I am safe and we have time to breathe, I want to hear you say all of this again. I want to believe it without fear clouding everything. And then I want to say yes to whatever you are asking me." "It is a promise," Xavier said, and he leaned down to kiss her. It was a gentle kiss, careful and sweet, the kind of kiss that spoke of beginning rather than desperation. Grace made a soft sound and leaned into him, and for one perfect moment, everything else fell away. The danger, the exhaustion, the uncertain future. There was only the two of them, the desert sunrise and the promise of something worth fighting for. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling despite everything. They gathered their horses and continued riding south, but something had shifted between them. They rode closer now, their knees occasionally bumping, their hands brushing when they stopped to water the horses. They talked more openly, sharing dreams and fears and all the small details that made up a life. Grace told Xavier about her dream of learning to read Spanish fluently, of maybe opening a small shop where she could sell her needlework. Xavier told Grace about his plans to expand his ranch, to build a proper house with multiple rooms and maybe even a second story. They talked about what it would be like to live in Mexico, the adjustments they would have to make, the life they could build together if they were brave enough to try. 3 days later, they saw the border. It was not much to look at, just a dry riverbed that marked the international boundary and a small collection of buildings on the Mexican side that served as a border station. But to Grace, it represented everything she had been fighting for, and Xavier saw her whole body sag with relief when she realized they had made it. They crossed in the late afternoon, riding up to the border station where a Mexican official checked their papers with bored efficiency. Xavier had brought his documentation proving he was a U.S. citizen, and Grace had nothing except her story. But the official seemed more interested in collecting the crossing fee than investigating their backgrounds, and within an hour, they were officially in Mexico. Grace dismounted on the Mexican side of the border and just stood there for a moment, her eyes closed and her face tilted toward the sun. Xavier watched her, feeling his own relief mix with something deeper and more complex. They had made it. Against all odds, with hired guns on their trail and everything working against them, they had gotten Grace to safety. Now came the harder part, building a life. They spent that first night in a small inn in the border town, paying for a room with the last of Xavier's U.S. currency. The room was simple but clean, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the dusty Main Street. Grace stood at the window for a long time, just looking out at the foreign country that was now her refuge. "It does not feel real yet," she said when Xavier came to stand beside her. "Part of me keeps waiting for Dutch Carver to kick down the door. He cannot touch you here," Xavier said. "Even if he tracked us this far, he has no authority in Mexico. You are safe, Grace, truly safe." She turned to look at him, and Xavier saw tears streaking down her face. "I never thought I would make it," she whispered. "There were so many times I wanted to give up, to just lie down in the desert and let it take me. But I kept thinking that somewhere out there was a place where I could breathe without fear, and I had to at least try to find it. And then you found me first, and you gave me everything I could not give myself." Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried with relief and exhaustion, and the release of weeks of constant tension. He stroked her hair and murmured reassurances, and when she finally quieted, he tilted her face up and kissed her forehead. "We made it together," he said. "And now we figure out what comes next, together." They stayed in the border town for a week, resting and recovering and starting to plan their future. Xavier sold one of the horses to a local rancher, which gave them enough money to live on while they figured out more permanent arrangements. Grace went to the market and bought fabric, starting work on new needlework pieces that she could sell. Xavier asked around about work and learned that there was a ranch about 30 miles south that was looking for a foreman, someone who knew cattle and could manage a crew. It was not the life Xavier had planned, but as he watched Grace slowly relax and start to smile more freely, he realized it was exactly the life he wanted. They were together, they were safe, and they had the freedom to build something new. On their 8th day in Mexico, Xavier woke to find Grace already awake, sitting by the window with her star map spread across her lap. She was adding new constellations, stitching fresh pathways that did not lead to safety, but instead marked their current location. When she saw him watching, she smiled. "I am making a new map," she explained. "One that shows where I am now instead of where I am trying to go. I want to remember this place, this moment when everything changed." Xavier got up and came to sit beside her, studying the intricate stitching. "That is beautiful," he said honestly. "You could sell pieces like that, I think. People would pay well for something so unique." "Maybe," Grace said, "but this one is not for sale. This one is mine, to remember the cowboy who found me mapping stars and helped me find my way somewhere safe." Xavier felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Grace," he said carefully, "I meant what I said before. I want to stay with you, build a life together. But I need to know that you want that too, not because you feel obligated or because you think you owe me, but because you genuinely want me in your life." Grace set down her needlework and turned to face him fully. "I want you," she said simply. "I want you in my life, in my future, in every way that matters. I have been on my own for so long that I forgot what it felt like to have a partner, someone who sees me as an equal instead of property. You gave me that, Xavier. You gave me safety and respect and something I did not even know I was looking for. Love." "Love," Xavier repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what this is?" "I think so," Grace said softly. "I have never felt anything like it before. When I was married, I thought love was supposed to hurt, that it was about sacrifice and endurance. But being with you feels like coming home. It feels like peace and joy and all the best parts of myself reflected back at me. If that is not love, I do not know what is." Xavier reached out and cupped her face in his hands, looking into her hazel eyes and seeing his entire future there. "Then marry me," he said. "Not because the law requires it or because anyone expects it, but because I want to promise you in front of the whole world that I will spend the rest of my life making sure you feel safe and loved and free to be whoever you want to be." Grace's eyes went wide with shock, then filled with tears again. But these were happy tears, and she was laughing even as they fell. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, but Xavier, we have to do it right this time. I want to choose everything, the date, the place, the vows. I want it to be about us, not about property or obligation or anything except love." "Whatever you want," Xavier promised. "We will do it your way, on your terms. I just want to be yours." "You already are," Grace said, and she kissed him. They were married 1 month later in a small church in the town where Xavier had taken the foreman job. Grace wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple white cotton with delicate embroidery that looked like constellations when the light hit it right. Xavier wore his best clothes, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. There were no guests except for the priest and 2 local families who had befriended them, but it did not matter. What mattered was the way Grace looked at Xavier when she said her vows, the absolute certainty in her voice when she promised to love and honor him for the rest of her life. And Xavier, who had spent years convinced he was better off alone, found himself making promises he intended to keep. To protect her, to respect her, to build a life with her where she would never again have to run or hide or fear the men who thought they could own her. After the ceremony, they had a simple meal with their new friends, then rode out to the small house that came with Xavier's job. It was not much, just 4 rooms and a porch, but Grace had already started making it feel like home. She had hung curtains in the windows, planted flowers in the dusty yard, and filled the kitchen with the smell of bread baking. Xavier looked around at all the small touches that marked the space as theirs, and he felt something settle deep in his chest, a contentment he had not known he was missing. That night as they lay together in their bed, Grace traced patterns on Xavier's chest and said quietly, "Thank you for finding me." "Thank you for trusting me," Xavier replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I know that was not easy. It was terrifying," Grace admitted. "But it was also the best decision I ever made. You gave me back my life, Xavier. You gave me myself." "We gave each other something," Xavier said. "I was just as lost as you were, just in a different way. I thought I was fine being alone, but I was really just too scared to risk getting hurt again. You taught me that some things are worth the risk." They talked late into the night, making plans and sharing dreams. Grace wanted to perfect her Spanish and maybe learn to read and write it as well. Xavier wanted to save enough money to buy a small piece of land where they could run their own cattle instead of working for someone else. They talked about children, both admitting they wanted them but agreeing to wait until they were more settled. They talked about the future with an openness and honesty that felt revolutionary after years of guarding their hearts. The months turned into years, and their life together grew richer and more complex. Xavier proved himself as a foreman, earning respect from the ranch hands and trust from the owner. Grace built a reputation for her needlework, selling intricate pieces to wealthy families in the larger towns, and teaching other women the art of celestial navigation through embroidery. They saved money carefully, and after 3 years, they had enough to buy 50 acres on the outskirts of town where they built their own small ranch. It was hard work building something from nothing, but they did it together. Xavier built the house with his own hands, a sturdy structure with 4 rooms and a wide porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. Grace planted a garden and raised chickens and learned to cook Mexican dishes that made Xavier groan with pleasure. They acquired cattle slowly, building their herd one animal at a time, and Xavier taught Grace everything he knew about ranching until she was as capable with the stock as he was. On their 5th anniversary, Grace gave Xavier a gift, a framed piece of her star map, the section that showed the constellations visible from the desert where he had first found her. Under the stars, she had stitched words in English and Spanish. "Here is where I learned that being lost is just another word for not yet found." Xavier hung it over their bed, and some nights when he could not sleep, he would lie awake looking at it and marveling at the strange path that had led them to each other. If his steer had not wandered, if he had taken a different route, if he had been one day earlier or later, he might never have found Grace mapping stars in the desert. The thought was enough to make him believe in something larger than chance, some benevolent force that brought lost souls together when they needed each other most. 6 months after their 5th anniversary, Grace told Xavier she was pregnant. They had been hoping for this, planning for it, but when it actually happened, they were both overwhelmed with a mixture of joy and terror. Xavier became ridiculously protective, insisting Grace rest more and let him handle all the heavy work. Grace tolerated his hovering with amusement, reminding him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. Their son was born on a clear spring night under a sky full of stars. Grace labored for 12 hours with a midwife from town attending, and Xavier paced outside until he wore a path in the dirt. When the midwife finally called him inside and placed the squalling, red-faced infant in his arms, Xavier felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This tiny human, barely 8 pounds of wrinkled skin and fierce lungs, was his son. His and Grace's together, a physical manifestation of everything they had built. They named him Samuel after the tracker who had helped them escape Dutch Carver all those years ago. Xavier had never learned what happened to Sam Godfrey and his nephew Daniel, whether their plan to trap Carver had succeeded or failed. But he figured naming his son after a man who had chosen to do right, even when it was dangerous, was a good way to honor that memory. Samuel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Clara, after Grace's mother. Clara had Grace's hazel eyes and Xavier's dark hair, and from the moment she could walk, she followed her father everywhere, insisting on helping with even the smallest ranch tasks. Samuel was quieter, more thoughtful, content to sit with his mother and watch her stitch intricate maps while she told him stories about the stars. Life was not always easy. They faced droughts and illness, difficult births in the cattle herd and lean years when money was tight. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. Grace never lost her wariness of strangers or her habit of mapping the stars, but the constant fear that had haunted her for so long gradually faded. She learned to trust that this life, this safety, was real and permanent. And Xavier, who had spent so many years alone, learned that family was not a burden but a gift, something that made every day richer and more meaningful. On their 10th anniversary, they rode back to the border, leaving the children with trusted friends for a few days. They crossed into the United States for the first time since Grace had fled, and Xavier took her to Gila Bend to see his old ranch. He had heard through contacts that Dutch Carver had indeed been trapped in Dead Man's Canyon by Sam and Daniel, and by the time he got free 3 weeks later, Grace was long gone and the trail was cold. Carver had returned to Grace's brother-in-law empty-handed, and the brother-in-law had died 2 years later in a barroom brawl, ending any legal claim on Grace forever. Xavier's ranch had been claimed by squatters in his absence, but he did not care. Standing in front of the cabin he had built with his father, he realized that this place was his past, not his future. His future was the woman standing beside him, the children waiting for them back in Mexico, the life they were building together one day at a time. "You regret leaving?" Grace asked quietly, reading his expression. "No," Xavier said honestly. "This was my father's dream, not mine. My dream is you, our children, the ranch we built together. That is home now." They returned to Mexico and to their life, and the years continued to pass in the way they do, full of ordinary joys and small sorrows. Samuel grew into a serious young man who loved astronomy and mathematics, and Grace taught him everything she knew about celestial navigation. Clara became a skilled horsewoman and rancher, capable of handling any task on the ranch with the same competence as her father. They added 2 more children to their family, twin boys named Thomas and Henry, who were holy terrors from the moment they could walk and kept everyone constantly entertained. Xavier and Grace grew older together, their faces weathering with sun and time but their love deepening with each passing year. They built a life that was rich not in material wealth but in the things that actually mattered: family, purpose, partnership. And every night, when the work was done and the children were asleep, they would sit on their porch and look up at the stars together, remembering the day in the desert when everything had changed. Grace never stopped making her star maps, though now they marked places she had been rather than places she was trying to reach. She created maps of the ranch, of the town, of all the familiar landscapes that made up her world. And when her children asked why she spent so much time stitching stars, she told them the truth, that there had been a time when she was lost and scared, and a kind cowboy had helped her find her way somewhere safe. And from that foundation of kindness, they had built something extraordinary. Xavier, listening to his wife tell their story to their children, would always add the same ending. Your mother was the bravest person I ever met. She taught me that being found is not about someone else saving you, but about choosing to trust that help when it is offered. She saved herself. I just had the honor of riding beside her while she did it. On their 25th anniversary, Xavier woke before dawn to find Grace already outside, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and watching the stars fade as the sun rose. He joined her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders against the morning chill. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How different my life could have been," Grace said softly. "If you had not found me that day, if I had died in the desert or been caught by Carver. I think about all the moments I would have missed, watching our children grow, building this ranch, growing old with you. It feels like a miracle sometimes that I get to have this life." "It is not a miracle," Xavier said. "It is what you fought for and earned. You made this life happen, Grace. You had the courage to run, to trust me, to build something new in a foreign country. That takes strength most people do not have. We built it together," Grace corrected gently. "Everything good in my life I share with you." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Around them, their ranch was starting to wake up. Cattle lowing in the distance, chickens scratching in the yard, the sounds of their children beginning to stir inside the house. It was an ordinary morning, unremarkable in almost every way, and it was absolutely perfect. Xavier thought about the young man he had been 25 years ago, alone on his ranch, and convinced he was better off that way. He thought about how close he had come to riding past that spot in the desert, to never finding Grace at all. And he thought about all the moments that had brought them here, the fear and danger, the long ride south, the leap of faith it took to choose love when everything in their pasts told them it was safer to stay alone. "I would do it all again," he said suddenly. "Every difficult moment, every risk, every sacrifice, I would do it all again for this." Grace looked at him with eyes that held 25 years of shared history, and she smiled. "So would I," she said. 1,000 times over I would choose you in this life." Their oldest son Samuel appeared in the doorway, tall and serious even at 23, on the verge of starting his own life. He looked at his parents sitting close together on the porch and smiled with the kind of understanding that came from being raised in a house full of love. "Breakfast is almost ready," he said. "Clara is making her special eggs, which means the kitchen is chaos and Thomas and Henry are being absolutely no help at all." "Sounds perfect," Xavier said, standing and helping Grace to her feet. "Let us go see what kind of disaster our children have created." They walked into the house together, hand in hand, ready for another ordinary, extraordinary day. And that night, like every night, Grace would stitch stars by lamplight while Xavier read aloud from whatever book they were working through, and their children would argue and laugh and fill the house with noise and life. This was what safe looked like. Not a destination marked on a map, but a life built with intention and love. Grace had mapped her way out of darkness using nothing but stars and determination, and Xavier had found her when she needed it most. Together, they had created something neither could have imagined when they started. A family, a home, a love that weathered every storm and came out stronger on the other side. Years later, when Grace was an old woman with silver hair and hands too arthritic to stitch the fine details she had once specialized in, she sat on that same porch with her great-grandchildren and told them about the cowboy who had found her mapping stars on Rawhide. She told them about fear and courage, about running toward hope instead of away from despair, about trusting kindness even when the world had taught you it did not exist. And when the children asked if she was scared during that long ride south, Grace would look at Xavier, still beside her after 50 years, and say honestly, "I was terrified. But I was also the bravest I had ever been, because I chose to believe that somewhere out there was a place where I could be safe and loved and free, and your great-grandfather helped me find it." Xavier, whose hair had gone silver and whose hands had grown gnarled with age and work, would always add, "She taught me that some people come into your life and change everything. Your great-grandmother was mapping her way to safety, and somehow she mapped her way straight to me. I have spent every day since then grateful for whatever force of nature or luck or destiny put her in my path. They lived long lives, Xavier and Grace, longer than either had any right to expect given the hardness of their early years. They saw their children grow and marry and have children of their own. They watched their small ranch prosper and grow into something their grandchildren would inherit and expand further. They faced losses and celebrated victories, always together, always partners in every sense of the word. When Xavier finally died at the age of 78, peaceful in his sleep after a long and satisfying life, Grace held his hand and whispered thank you for finding her all those years ago. And when she followed him 6 months later, her children found her sitting in her favorite chair with her original star map across her lap, her fingers resting on the constellation that marked the exact spot where a lonely cowboy had found a desperate woman mapping her way to somewhere safe. They buried her next to Xavier on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Under a sky full of the stars she had spent a lifetime learning to navigate. And if you visit that place today, you can still see the small marker that bears both their names and the simple inscription they chose together years before. Here lie Xavier Kincaid and Grace Zimmerman Kincaid. He found her mapping stars. Together they found home. Their children and grandchildren continued the traditions they had started, teaching celestial navigation through needlework, running cattle with respect for the land and the animals, treating people with the kind of practical kindness that did not ask for recognition or reward. The story of how their matriarch and patriarch met became family legend, told and retold with each generation, a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we take toward each other. And in the town nearby, in the small church where Xavier and Grace had married all those years ago, there hangs a framed piece of star map embroidery that Grace donated before she died. Under the intricate stitching of constellations, she had added words in both English and Spanish that summed up everything she had learned in her long life. Safe is not a place you reach. It is a person you trust. It is a life you build. It is choosing hope even when fear tells you to run. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, safe is a cowboy who finds you mapping stars in the desert and helps you navigate your way home. That piece hangs there still, faded now with age but still beautiful, still meaningful. And people who see it, even if they do not know the full story, can sense that it represents something important. A love that survived against impossible odds, a courage that refused to give up, and a partnership that proved that sometimes the best destinations are the ones you create together rather than the ones marked on any map. Xavier and Grace's story did not end with their deaths. It lives on in their descendants, in the ranch they built, in the small acts of kindness that ripple out from people who heard their story and decided to be a little braver, a little kinder, a little more willing to help strangers who need it. Because that is what happens when two people choose love over fear and build something real together. The effect spreads far beyond their individual lives, touching people and places they will never know. The cowboy found her mapping stars on Rawhide, navigating her way somewhere safe. And together, they created a home where safety was not just the absence of danger, but the presence of love, respect, partnership, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from building a life with someone who sees all of you and chooses you anyway, every single day. That is the true ending of their story, not in death but in legacy, not in dramatic gestures but in the quiet accumulation of days lived well and love given freely. Xavier and Grace Kincaid found each other when both were lost, and together, they mapped a course to somewhere neither could have reached alone. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes the greatest adventures are not about the destination at all, but about who you choose to travel beside.